Hello and welcome. So, the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide was published a few days ago, 4 days ago, and now gradually people are reading it and coming back with a lot of questions. So, I thought it would be helpful if I go through the PMBOK guide for you here like this and explain it a little bit. It's going to be, I will try to keep it short, but don't expect a 10-minute overview or something like that, because I really want to tell you the essence of the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide, and it will take some time. I don't know how much time I need, but by the time you're watching it, you can see it on the bottom of the video. So, the other thing that I have to tell you before I start is that I was one of the 12 core development team members, which may create some confusion here. Please note that everything that I tell you here is my personal opinion, and I'm not creating this video for PMI, or I'm not even representing the development team. It's just me, you and I together, okay? It's like a simple, friendly conversation. I won't create a fancy video. And I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a thunderstorm outside. So I hope you can hear me properly. All right, so let's begin. Here we have a copy of the PMBOK guide, and there we have a mind map, which is empty, and I'm going to fill it in for you, right? When we come here to the table of contents, and by the way, that's my keyboard, don't worry about it, it's a mechanical keyboard, it makes a lot of noise. All right, so the table of contents, do you see it here? It says the standard for project management, and then we have a number of chapters, and we come here, and there's a next section, it's called the guide to the project management body of knowledge. That's where we start. So we have PMBOK Guide 7th edition, and it has 2 sections. One of them is the standard, and the other one is the guide. We've always had these 2 sections before, well, except maybe for a couple of first editions. But after that, it was there all the time. The standard is the part that follows ANSY's standard guidelines and so on. And for those of you who have been following up with everything in the PMBOK guide, you know that we had an exposure draft before where we invited everyone to come and tell us what they think about it. That exposure draft was about the standard and not the guide. We didn't have to have exposure draft for the guide, but we needed to have it for the standard based on the guidelines. And to help keep everyone focused on the most important part of it, which is the standard, we prefer to do it with that. But that's for the public exposure. Other than that, there were 2 teams of reviewers, 70 people, I think. I don't remember if it was 70 per team or 70 in total, but there were many people. And those people have reviewed the guide as well. Okay? So, let's go back here to the standard. In the standard, we have an introduction, and then we have the value delivery system. Okay, let's start with the introduction. That's just an introduction, and as you expect, it's not the most interesting part of it. One thing that is important when it comes to the introduction is that we have the terminology here. So, for example, what is a project? What is a program? What is a portfolio? Of course, we need to talk about programs and portfolios in order to understand projects better than before. And then, of course, what is project management and project manager? Now, this is very important here. There's a big difference between project management and project manager. Project management is the concept, but project manager is a role. Now, what we really want to have in projects is project management. Having a single centralized role of project manager in order to have proper project management is a very common way. It's a very effective way of doing that, but it's not the only way. We can also have decentralized project management, and that's okay. So remember that the PMBOK guide is about project management and not about project managers. So there are other things in the introduction as well, but they are not super sensitive. So let's go to the next one, which is value delivery. We have this new chapter here because we talk a lot about value in this edition of the PMBOK guide, and we need to have a simple definition of value. Although we didn't give one definition, but we gave an idea of different types of definition. For example, a very well-formed definition for value is the benefits to cost ratio, but there are others as well. It's usually a comparison between benefits and costs, and when you think about it, remember that anything can be a benefit. It's not only about the money that you earn, it's also about the knowledge that you gain. It's about the opportunities that you create for the future. Or, I don't know, you enter a new market and so on. Even for some non-for-profit organizations, things like the safety of people in the community can be a benefit, or quality of life, things like that. So that's how broad it is, which also makes it more complicated to talk about. Something else that we have to talk about is the nature of value, which is subjective, meaning that what is value for me may not be value for you. So in order to manage value properly, we really need to understand the parties who are involved in that value delivery system. And as you may know, it really primarily depends on the strategies, and that's what we do in the portfolio management system. Something that I personally find very important is that you can almost never, manage value completely inside the borders of your project. You always need to think about all your projects and a lot of other things in order to manage it properly, which makes it the subject of your portfolio management system. But still, when it comes to the projects, we need to support that portfolio management layer and also use ideas related to value. That's why we have it here. All right. The other thing here, well, we have the idea of components involved in it. For example, programs, portfolios, and so on. And the other thing that we have is functions in the project. Those are part of the whole ecosystem that create value. Those functions are the types of actions that we need to do. Actually, first we wanted to describe the roles, but then we couldn't find a good way of doing that because the PMBOK guide is not a methodology, but it tries to give you a guide that you can use with any type of methodology. And the roles that you have depend on your methodology, and they are not always the same. So even for a simple role like project manager, we cannot comfortably talk about project manager outside a methodology. So instead of talking about the roles, we decided to talk about the functions, the type of things that you do. And different types of function will be packaged in different types of role, and you will give it to one person or a few people. What we really want to communicate here is that these are the functions that you probably need in every type of project, or at least need most of them. And therefore, it's a good idea for you to review the roles that you have and make sure that they have the skills needed to do that. And it's also part of their role definition. These are the most important things. And of course, there are others as well. So This was the second part of the standard. The third part, when we go down, is here. The principles that you've heard a lot about. So, the previous versions of the PMBOK guide, all of them were based on processes. 40 something, a little more than 40, usually between 40 and 50 processes. Each process had inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques, and so on. This version is not process-based. This version is principle-based. The things that you see here. And the reason for that is that, well, you can think of it like this. Processes are mainly about the outputs that you create, and how you do things. But principles are mainly about the outcomes, purposes, goals, and so on. This is the important difference here. Processes are more useful when we don't start with processes, but we start with principles. And then after we gain the understanding, use it in order to form our processes. A really common problem is that many people do have processes, rituals, artifacts, and so on, but they don't get the results that they expect. And that's usually because they do it without understanding why they do that. And that's the cargo cult problem, which is really huge. So our idea is to avoid the cargo cult problem, the cargo cult effect. Look it up, it's very interesting. That really happens. Some people think, for example, as long as they have a document they call business case or project charter and so on, they have proper project management, which is not necessarily the case. Well, some people think that as long as they get together every day and call that meeting daily Scrum, and then they have lots of whiteboards and sticky notes on those whiteboards, then they are agile, which is, again, not necessarily the case. Different methodologies have a lot of things in common. They are usually there to solve similar problems. And those common things can be summarized in principles. That's what we're going to do. So, let's go and start here. The first principle is I'm going to summarize them. Stewardship. That's the first one. It's about the idea that you're supposed to be a facilitator and a supporter instead of a boss for people. You're not there to only give orders. You're there to support a bunch of people who are expert in what they are doing, or they are very capable. But in order to work together and deal with the environment of the project, they will run into a lot of problems. You are there as the project manager or the project management team to make it easier for them. And besides everything else, you also need to think about the ethical aspects. Not a boss, be ethical. And some people have the idea that the project manager is the highest role. They are there to tell people what to do, basically. And I know that there are some organizations who have such experiences in the past, and therefore the phrase project manager doesn't have a good connotation in their organization. Once what I did was I suggested they change the label, because labels are not important. So instead of calling people project managers, we started calling them Chief Project Facilitators. And I really, really like this title. Now, I mentioned ethical behavior. There's something important here. We had this discussion to add ethical behavior as a principle, but then we decided not to do that, but understand it as something in a higher level of abstraction. So instead of being a principle, it is something that applies to all principles. We can call it a meta principle. So in addition to the principles, we also have one meta principle, which is ethical behavior. And as you may know, PMI has a publication about professional conduct and ethical behavior, which is helpful. So back to the principles. We talked about this first one, and the next one here is about collaboration. And again, I'm summarizing them because that's easier to type. But you can see the real title over there. What we really need in projects is great teams, not great individuals. That's important. Great teams versus great individuals. So what it means is that a team is not the same as a group of people, a group of random people that are together. You really need to enable them as a team. You need to create connections there and help them collaborate with each other. They need to have an understanding of what a project is. In many organizations, when they have a functional system, the functional departments assign different tasks of each project to different people inside their departments. And sometimes, unfortunately, those people don't even have a sense of projects. They just deal with the specialist activities. It is okay. It is absolutely fine to have a functional system. There's no problem with that. But they also need to have an understanding of the project. They need to be in touch with their peers in other departments and together work and collaborate and so on. And it is your responsibility as a person in charge to make sure that it happens and enable it, not order people. Remember the previous principle. Something else that we need here is defining roles and responsibilities. Which is more or less like what we have in one of the principles in Prince 2, actually. One of the principles is defined roles and responsibilities. Let me add it at the end. Which is always helpful. In any project, we need people to know what is expected from them and what they can expect from the others. Now, sometimes your roles and responsibilities are extremely simple, for example, like Scrum. And sometimes it's more complicated, like DSDM or Prince 2. But it's always there. And you need to pay attention to that. The other thing is that we really need to have team building. Is it hyphenated? I think so. Team building. But that's real team building. A lot of things that people call team building is really mainly a waste of time, unfortunately. But real team building doesn't even need to look like what most people call team building. You can use any opportunity for that. For example, in P3 Express, there are certain kickoff meetings. And for the kickoff meeting, there are two purposes. One is the typical purpose that you have where you want to communicate certain types of information and align everyone. But the more important thing in those kickoff meetings is to use it as an opportunity, as an excuse for team building. And it's something that happens frequently, so it's not a one-time thing. You have monthly kickoff meetings as well, so it happens again and again and again. So this is about collaboration. And what's the next one? Engaging with stakeholders. Let me close these. Or I don't know, maybe you want to see them. Let me close these. Yeah, that makes more sense. I leave this open. Engagement of the stakeholders. It's exactly what you expect from it. So it's about the fact that you need to identify your stakeholders, which is a problem in many projects. They don't identify all stakeholders and then they are surprised. So the classical elements is to identify them, to engage them, and so on. Then the other thing that you need to consider is that the level of engagement that we need to have here depends on your delivery method. And you need to understand that you cannot do stakeholder engagements without considering your delivery method. In a predictive system, you want their engagement for specifications, for acceptance testing, and so on. In adaptive systems, you want their engagement mainly for the feedback. And when I say feedback, it may be confusing because, well, before I said testing, and testing is a type of feedback. But what we mean here in adaptive projects, in agile projects, we have a very special type of feedback in mind, and that's the feedback we can use for adaptation. And it's probably best if I don't go through all of that detail, because then it will be many hours long, this video. All right. The point here is that be in touch with your stakeholders. That's the simplest way of saying that. All right. Who's next? Focus on value. Okay. All right. So this one has caused some confusion already for some people. First of all, think of it like this. We create outputs, the deliverables in the project, for example. Those outputs create outcomes, and outcomes are the results of using those outputs. And those outcomes create benefits. Benefits, which you can think of as value. So what some people may be thinking is that in adaptive projects, we may be focused on the outcomes and value and let the output evolve, let the product evolve. Let me write it here. This is the product. This is the result of the product. Yeah. But you may be thinking that that is the case in an adaptive project, but in predictive projects, we are mainly focused on the product because the product is designed upfront. It's a different layer of management. It's a program management or portfolio management that is mainly focused on that, which is correct. I can even write it here. Maybe I should break it down. No, I don't know. So this part is done by projects. This is the main concept, main center of attention for programs. And this is the main center of attention for portfolios. That's the classical way of understanding these elements. So when you want to build a bridge, for example, which makes it a predictive project, you're not continuously thinking about value and then try to see how you can translate that into a bridge, because your bridge is already designed. But we still need to understand the business justification of that project. We may not be going to have an adaptive project, but we need to understand why we are doing it and how it's going to solve a problem. When we do that, we can use that in our high-level decision making. And in fact, the focus on value principle in the PMBOK guide, it's more or less like the principle in Prince 2 of continuous what happened? Continuous business justification. It's more like that. Not entirely, but partially at least. That's the part that applies to every type of project. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't focus on the product. No, it's a different concept here. And you know that Prince 2 says that you need to focus on the product. That's because of the difference in perspective. When it says you need to focus on product, it's because it wants to tell you that instead of paying attention to the activities, to the work that you do, pay attention to the thing that you want to create. And then besides that, Prince 2 tells you that you need to also understand the business justification of the project. We have the same thing here, more or less. The part about business justification is formulated like this, that you need to focus on value. The other thing that is interesting, I remember we had this ITIL course. I'm not expert in ITIL at all. It's about service management. It's not about projects, at least not directly. And there was this really, really great trainer, Ivor McFarlane. He was giving the course for the eLearning course. And there was this part that he explained that ITIL has changed from thinking about value creation to something else. And that something else is value co-creation. Is it hyphenated? I don't know. Yeah, it's okay. And that's very interesting, because value is not created in isolation. It's not done by a limited number of people. It's a chain of the customer, suppliers, subcontractors, end users, and so on, that together create value. And I think that makes a lot of sense. If you really want to understand value and manage it, I think it would be helpful to pay attention to that as well. Let me save the file. Okay. What's next? System interactions. System interactions. All right. It's an interesting one, and it's an umbrella for a few related concepts. For example, having a holistic view to the project. Instead of thinking about only a few things that are obvious, try to understand everything that's are connected to each other. That's basically the concept that we have in change management, for example, for those of you who are familiar with the PMBOK guide, or anything else that has to do with projects. It's also about the concept of integration, which is really key in all the previous versions of the PMBOK guide. Actually, if you ask me before to summarize the PMBOK guide, the the 6th edition or the editions before that, I would have said it's about integrating project management activities and about being proactive instead of reactive. That's how important it is, and that's here in the new version. It's also about understanding the nature of behaviors in the project, the non-linear behaviors. And something else that is very useful here, it's about critical thinking. As a project manager, if you want to be really successful, you have to be a critical thinker. And a critical thinking in general, it's about the process of making decisions. It's about the biases that we have that may fool us. They always fool all of us, but to different degrees. We can learn about them and control them and get better results. And there are even some frameworks for decision making. This is very important in my opinion. And there are many great books about it. I will add a few suggestions to the description in case you're interested. You can start learning about them. So these were a few examples of what it means to pay attention to systems interactions. Okay, I'm running out of tea. I'll go get another cup of tea and I'll be right back. I'm back. All right. So the next principle is about leadership. And when it comes to leadership, there are two different types of understanding when it comes to leadership. One of them is about managers, especially high-level managers who lead people. That's one concept. But there's also something that I call public leadership or free leadership or open leadership. I don't know. None of these are official words from any resource. It's a type of leadership that is not limited to a manager. Anyone can have that type of leadership. It's not my invention at all. It's something that exists in the literature about leadership. It's more of a modern understanding of it. And when it comes to that part of leadership, it's even more important for us. As a project manager or someone else who's leading the project, so that's leadership number one. Okay. As that type of person, you have to be careful with leadership number two, which is about people who are not managers, but some of those people have this natural tendency to be leaders, to help other people in the project. That's how they are satisfied. That's what they really want to do. But they may not be able to do it all the time. You need to enable them. You need to support them. And it's important for you to understand that part and really take advantage of that. That's it about leadership. Two different aspects of leadership. And of course, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to something like leadership. The next one is about tailoring. And you know how important it is. As you will see, we even have a chapter about tailoring. So we have the principle here that tells you how important it is to tailor and the fact that it's necessary to tailor all the time for every type of project. And then there's a chapter that tells you how to do that. And when it comes to tailoring, there are really a lot of problems. There are many people who try to implement a methodology or any other type of resource like the PMBOK guide as it is in the book. And it usually doesn't work. This is also a principle in Prince2. It really doesn't work if you don't customize it for your project. And you can only do it when you really understand why these things are here. And that's another reason why we are starting with the principles. That's starting with the understanding. So back to one of my previous examples. When we talk about the business case, you as the project manager have to understand why we need to have a business case and how it helps the project. And then based on the needs of your project and the capabilities in the project, you will decide how to take care of business case and, more importantly, take care of the business justification of your project. But yeah, I think that was everything. There's also a chapter about how to do it. All right. The next one. The next principle, where am I? Yeah, it's better like this. Even like this. All right. So, quality. Quality. It's about a simple concept. Don't think of quality as something that you bolt into your elements in the project, into your deliverables or processes. Integrate it into what you do. Integration instead of bolted into ness. Well, how do you say it? Don't bolt it into the system, but integrate it. That's better. That's the main message really here. Also, I see a lot of people who think that having a proper quality management system is expensive. But the fact is that it's only expensive if you don't do it properly. If you do it properly, it is less expensive. And when is it more expensive and not appropriate? When you've not tailored it properly. The same thing happens for the whole project management system. I've heard some people saying that, for example, yeah, I like Prince2 a lot, but I don't use it in my project because that's very expensive for us. We are a small company. Well, then your interpretation of Prince2 is not correct. You're not tailoring it properly. Prince2 is something that is designed to help you reduce your costs, reduce your troubles in the project, and so on. All right, that was about quality. What else do we have? What's next? Navigate complexity. Complexity. Sometimes we forget about the complex nature of projects, which is because of sources. It's because of having people involved in the project. People are complicated. That's just how it is. And there are competing elements in the project. You fix one of them and it breaks two other things. And a lot more. All of them together create complexity in the project. And when you recognize the complexity, then you will be more comfortable managing that complexity. It's important to notice that in order to manage complexity, you don't need to have a complex or complicated system. You can still have a simple system and use it to deal with complexity. You can use a simple system to deal with complexity. How do you do that? That's the part that needs creativity and experience and so on. But one thing that is important here is that there's also separate publication in PMI about navigating complexity. Take a look at it. Maybe it's useful to you. The next one, optimize risk responses. Okay. We need to deal with uncertainties and we need to do it proactively. That's the most important thing. That really summarizes all of these things. The problem is that some people don't do risk management in a structured way, and when they structure their risk management system, it's not practical anymore. It's too complicated or just unrealistic. When you take a look at risk registers, a lot of times what many people identify as risks are not even risks. They are the impacts of the risk or something else. For example, I've seen it a lot of time that they say, we have the risk that the project may be delayed. That's not a risk. Come on. So there are lots of resources about that. PMI has publication about risk. Axelos has one, MOR, Management of Risk, which I really like. It's very practical, I think. And also remember that you don't bolt it into the system. Meaning that don't create a system, don't start doing everything and then add one artifact or a few events to say that we have risk management, but integrate it into everything. That's when you can really take advantage of your risk management system. Okay, the next one, adaptability. Now here things may become a little bit confusing for some people. I've seen the question. Some people think that the new version of the PMBOK guide is more leaning toward agile projects. That's not exactly right. The fact is that the previous versions of the PMBOK guide were more leaning toward predictive systems. And it's not so easy to create a process-based system that is compatible with both predictive and adaptive systems. And that's the other reason we decided to have a principle-based system, because it's a lot easier to adapt it to everything. So the goal right now is to have the whole standard and the guide in a way that is applicable to every type of project, both predictive and adaptive. It's not that we are paying more attention to agile projects, it's that we are paying equal attention to everything that is there. Now you may be thinking, if this is so, and we want to support both of them, then why do we have a principle about adaptability? And the reason we have it is that when we think about adaptation, there can be two different subjects for it. One can be the product, and that's for agile projects. The product in agile projects is created with an adaptive system. But we also have the process, and that's for all projects. Regardless of how you create your product, still your processes for managing the project and creating the product has to be adaptive, meaning that you will go on with an initial type of tailoring, see how it works, and based on the feedback that you get from the system, from the project environment, you will adapt your project management system. That is really necessary for every type of project. That's the main topic here in this principle, the adaptation for processes. All right. And the next one is, the last one. You're there. How long have I been recording? Okay, 40 minutes. It's getting a little bit longer. Change. Enable change to achieve the envisioned future state. There are changes that are the result of the product that you create in your project. And there are changes that are the result of the processes that you have. Product, like the one before actually. Both of these need attention. When it comes to the product, when we think about the changes that are the result of the product, there's a big overlap here between what we may be able to do in the projects and what we are supposed to do in the program management system. Meaning that a lot of it will be done there. For example, when you think about organizational change initiatives, most of them are practically programs and not projects, meaning that you need to use a program management system, not a project management system. And so most of the worries that you may have about changes, about enabling changes, will be taken care of in your program management system. But still, we need to support it in our project management system as well. The other thing is that what we do with our processes inside the project, that's also about a change. And that change should be taken care of. And as you can imagine, both of these last two principles, adaptation and change, they have a lot to do with tailoring. That's in fact the case with many of them. When you think about it, many of them have overlaps. So if you are reading two different principles and you can't think of a big overlap between the two of them, don't worry. There's no problem. It's not about you misunderstanding the PMBOK guide. There's always overlaps here. Okay. Let me collapse all of these. So, these were the principles in the PMBOK guide, in the new version of the PMBOK guide. And if you're interested, you can also take a look at other principles. For example, Prince2 has principles, DSDM has principles. I think XP, Extreme Programming, I think it had principles as well. And of course, there's Noop that I was involved with. Noop is not a project management system with principles, it's only principles, nearly universal principles of projects. Nearly universal. What's the problem with that? Universal principles of projects. Why does it underline everything here? Which language is it using? English. Wow. Okay. So you can take a look at them as well. And just like that, we are done with the standard, with the 3 sections we had in the standard. And now we can start talking about the guide. Okay, for the guide, let me go to the table of contents. Here we start with an introduction again, which is not super sensitive, of course, like every other introduction. Then we have the domains, which is a new concept in the 7th edition of the PMBOK guide. It's a little bit like the themes in Prince2, a little like the themes in Prince2. And on the other hand, you may be thinking that it is the knowledge areas in the previous versions versus knowledge areas. And the answer is no, not really. The knowledge areas in the previous versions of the PMBOK guide were mainly output oriented, but the domains are outcome oriented. That's the difference here. And then when we go on, you will see that there are overlaps between what we have in the domains and what you've seen before in the principles. That's also natural. But the perspective is different. When we talk about domains, we are thinking about the outputs, but when we were talking about the principles, we were mainly focused on the goals and purposes and so on. That's the difference here. And especially what I wrote here, all of these are not the actual names of principles. These are just abbreviations, the keywords. Make sure you will check the actual names. Okay. So let's just start talking about the domains. Notes, let me move them here. The first principle is stakeholder performance domain. The stakeholder performance domain is mainly about different types of things that you need to do in order to engage your stakeholders. And as you know, you go through, you identify them first, then you analyze them, then you may categorize them, prioritize, things like that. And finally, you may come up with a plan for engagement, and then you run that plan and engage the stakeholders, and then you will monitor them, and so on. Yeah, these are the typical things. That's all. And it's about every type of stakeholder, obviously. Anyone who is a stakeholder, meaning that the person has an interest in the project and can impact the project. But then the next domain, as you see here, is team performance domain. It's about the subset of the stakeholders. That's the internal stakeholders. For the internal stakeholders, we need to do extra things. We need to have team building. We need to help them grow as individuals. You know, that's one of your responsibilities, and it's actually an ethical responsibility as well. You're not only responsible for paying them their salaries, you also need to give them opportunities to grow as experts in their fields. Then you need to motivate them, I don't know, resolve their conflicts and lead them, a lot of things like that. And when it comes to leadership, as we talked about before, we have centralized leadership and also decentralized leadership. You have to consider both of them, see which one works better for you. The next domain is about the development approach and the life cycle. The development approach is the way you create your product, and basically it's either predictive or adaptive. Some people consider other types, for example, hybrid and so on. For me, it's predictive or adaptive. That's the way I understand it. Do you remember the principle that we had here about systems interactions? This one. One of the elements here was critical thinking, right? So one of its impacts here was that nowadays most people refer to the predictive systems as traditional versus agile. Adaptive is another name for agile. Some people consider differences. I don't. But the point is that both of these systems are really great. Both of them are valid, and each of them is more appropriate for a certain type of product, for a certain type of project. There are people who think that Agile can be used in every type of project and it's the better option. I don't agree with them at all. And in fact, most projects need a predictive system. But there are some projects like IT development where an adaptive system, Agile, can be really useful for you. Now, when you recognize both of these predictive and adaptive systems as valid systems, then you should not call one of them traditional. Because if you call it traditional, then you're giving it a negative connotation. Everyone wants to use something that is more modern and new and so on. So calling it traditional creates a bias. And because we want to be good critical thinkers, then we come to the conclusion that it's not a good idea to call it waterfall or traditional, and just call it predictive. And that's what we did in the PMBOK guide. Waterfall is also not a good name because waterfall, the word waterfall, has been used in the Agile community with a really, really negative connotation. They have always used it to question the predictive systems, and some of them have considered it as the enemy. So if you use that word again, it will have a negative connotation. That's not a good thing. So anyway, the point in here is that we always have a development approach, and you have to be careful about it. Consider different types of approach, know how they work, and then decide which one is better for your type of project. And obviously, then you need to tailor your project management system. All right, that was it. The next one is planning. First, every type of project. Oh, come on. I cannot type well when you're watching. Every type of project needs planning. It's not only about predictive projects. Adaptive projects have planning as well. They just have a different type of planning. But other than that, the way you plan also depends on a lot of things. Not every predictive project, for example, has the same type of planning. It depends on how sensitive your project is, how large your project is, the capabilities that you have in the project, and a lot more. You have to do it in a way that makes it useful in your project. You have to understand the purpose of planning. You should think holistically. Now it's better. And remember to have a purpose for everything you do. I remember, for example, when I started as a project planner. And there were some people who used to come to me and say, why don't you have, for example, resources in your schedule in that certain type of project? And my answer was that we don't need it. It's better like this. It's simpler like this. And some of them used to say that, no, you must have resources. That's how planning works. And for example, the PMBOK guide says that you need to have resources. No, it doesn't say. It's saying that having resources in your schedule is one way of doing that. It depends. It really depends on the type of project. When I started as a planner in those types of projects that I had, I think my plans, my schedules have like 6, 7, 8,000 activities. And then as I learned more about scheduling and project management, I started making it more complicated. And I reached a time where I had about 30,000 activities in my schedules. And then I realized that I'm not doing it well enough. What I'm getting out of those schedules, it is not worth all the trouble. And our energies are best spent elsewhere. So I reduced it again. And actually, I think I reduced it to 2,000 to 3,000 activities. And then I was getting a better result. So remember, tailor it always. And one other thing, plans are not static. If you create a plan once and keep it like that for the whole life cycle of the project, then you don't really have a plan. Plans cannot be static. You must always refine and revise your plans. Okay? So those things that some people, those Gantt charts that they print and put on the wall and keep them for 2 years, that's not what we call planning. Okay. The next domain is project work. It's simply about executing the project. I'm not going to go through the details here. The next one, the delivery domain. It's about delivering the expected outputs. Delivering the expected outputs. So we do also think about the outputs. Of course, we have to. It's about the project. So remember, we had this conversation about the outputs that create outcomes, that create benefits or value, in other words. We have to do a lot here in this domain. We have to understand what creates the type of output that we have in mind. And when we think about it, for example, it covers both the scope of those outputs or deliverables, if you want to call it like that, and the quality of them. You have to take care of both of them. And in order to do that, we have to take care of requirements. We start with the requirements, we create breakdowns, not necessarily, but usually. And then after that, we go through the details of the scope and quality. And our purpose here is to make sure that what we create really satisfies the expectations. Yeah, that's it. So the next one is the measurements. Measurement domain. We're scrolling. All right. So this one is about measuring the performance of the project, progress measurement, which is always necessary because we do have our plans and we go on with our plans, especially in a predictive, plan-driven project. But still, let me write it down here. We need performance measurement in every type of project. The way we do it is different in different types of projects. It's not the same in predictive and adaptive projects, but we still need to have some form of it. Make sure that you don't measure the wrong things. Some people keep measuring, I don't know, they only compare the actual progress to the planned progress, or for IT projects, they check the lines of code that was created and things like this. These are not helpful. You may need to do it anyway, but that's not what you report to stakeholders. The most important thing that you need to have in a lot of projects is forecasts. Whenever you give stakeholders, managers, something other than the forecasts, they will try to use that information to guess what those values would be. They try to forecast everything, either intuitively or they actually calculate. But even when they do calculate, they are not always so successful in doing that. It's not easy. But for you as a project manager or as a project planner, which is a project management team member, you're the expert in that area. You can go and learn how to do that and do it properly. So, for example, for forecasting the completion dates, a good thing is the earned schedule method. It's really good. Take a look if you're working in predictive projects. In adaptive projects, you may have everything time boxed. You have time boxed iterations, and you can maybe time box the whole project. DSDM, for example, has time boxed projects. So it doesn't make sense to think about the forecast for the completion date. You know the completion date. But instead, what you would forecast is the scope that will be done during that time box. All right, so be careful about that. In adaptive projects, make sure you're not only focused on velocity or things like that, or something that is very common, unfortunately. People keep comparing the amount of user stories that they finished in a certain iteration to the whole number of user stories they had for that iteration. That's the wrong measurement. That's wrong. And by that, I mean that it's even harmful to do that, because then you're pushing everyone in the project to be focused on having 100% completion for that. And then you will have the Parkinson law, the student syndrome, and a lot of other things that will reduce your productivity. So focus on what you want to get. Measure what you want to get out of the project, or proxies that are good representations of those things. And then, of course, when you have the values, you also want to report them. And the way you do it, well, let's call it representation of those values. It can be a typical report, or it can be a dashboard or something like that. For both of them, there's this field of knowledge called information visualization. And you can get a lot of really, really interesting information about the best way of representing information to make it more effective, because that's what we want to do. You do calculate everything, you create a report, and you expect it to have an impact on your stakeholders. Information visualization will help you. Also, the other thing that can help you is that, for example, when it comes to reports, keep them simple. Those huge reports that we sometimes send to other people, that's frightening. They may even ask you to make it bigger, but it doesn't really communicate information. In most projects, a one-page report is the most effective one. You may want to have that big report still for some reason, but give them both of them. Give them the big report plus 1 page of summary, most important things. And then you will have a better relationship with your stakeholders. Remember, we had domains for stakeholders. We have principles about all of these. All right, so we've got one more domain. And after that, I'm going to take a break. All right. The last one is, where am I? Okay, performance. Oh, no, uncertainty. Uncertainty. This domain is about risks, obviously, and related concepts. Some people may call it similar concepts, but I would call it related concepts. But anyway, it's about the things that you know, identify them, analyze them, and go on until you have responses, and then go on with managing those. It's all about being proactive. That's the most important thing that happens here with anything related to risk management. And also, have a purpose. Do it purposefully. And keep it simple. Keep it simple and have a purpose. Okay. We're almost done. I'm going to take a short break and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. So, we went through the domains together. Let me collapse all of them. So, this is the list of domains. And the next one here is tailoring, which is a whole chapter. I think it's great to have so much content about tailoring because that's extremely important for us. And as you remember, we also had a principle about tailoring. Here, this one. All right. So when it comes to tailoring, in this chapter, we talk about why we need to tailor, although that may be really obvious. Then what should be tailored? Which elements are supposed to be tailored? And then we have some content about how you would tailor something. And in that part, what we had in mind is that you have two different levels of tailoring. If you want to do it really effectively, you can have one level, but it's not too efficient. One of them, the first level, is for the organization, because you probably have similar projects, and similar projects need similar project management systems. Instead of reinventing the wheel all the time, you can create one partially tailored system for all of them in your organization level, or you can have multiple portfolios and create multiple partially tailored systems. And then whenever you want to start a project, you will pick one of them and you will tailor it for the project. That makes it easier. Now, when you think about it, when it's in the organization level, it's usually done in what most people call a PMO, Project Management Office, or Program Management Office, Portfolio Management Office, a central place in your organization. And for the projects, we have an initial tailoring. That's what we do at the beginning. You decide how to run your project, how to do your project management. And then there's also a continuous tailoring, which is really related to, let me find it, this one. We need to adapt. So it doesn't matter how well you think about the whole project and come up with a project management system. You may create a really good tailored version, but still you have to see how it works throughout your project. And based on that, based on the feedback that you get from your environment, you have to tailor it again and again and again until you get the best results. And of course, what we get here from the project level, it feeds back to the thing that we have in the organization level. So even for that, we also have continuous tailoring or continuous improvement of the partially tailored system. All right. So that was about the tailoring chapter. And next, we have the chapter about models, methods, and artifacts. This chapter mentions a lot of things, but the PMBOK guide is not an encyclopedia of everything related to projects, or it's not even there to teach you how to do those things. These are only mentions, and it works as a teaser. The whole point of having those things is to let you take a look and see, maybe you will find something, some inspiration. You may find it helpful for your project. You will go learn more about it, and so on. In here, when it comes to models, for example, you will see things that may be familiar to you. The Kahneman model, you will see those theory of X, theory of Y, and so on. There's the Kahneman model, lots of things like that. And you will also see there were process groups from the previous versions of the PMBOK guide. That's also a model. And as a reminder, if you need to access the old processes, the place where you can find them is the Standards Plus platform. It's an online platform from PMI where you can go and find a lot of details about the standards, including the PMBOK guide. So also for the methods, you can find things like earned value management, earned schedule, although I'm not sure if you mentioned earned schedule. I think we should have, but anyway. SWOT analysis, and so on. And for the artifacts, it mentions a lot of things. For example, business cases, business case, or project brief, which is a Prince2 concept, backlogs, which is typically a Scrum concept, and so on, or Gantt chart. Something you have to be really careful about is that these are all mentions, these are teasers. It doesn't mean that you can have an understanding of what, for example, project brief means in isolation. What project brief means depends on the whole system in Prince2 or any other system that uses the same phrase, project brief. Or the business case. What a business case really means depends on the system that you have, the way you use your business case, and so on. So be careful with the context. We don't have the context here. Okay, that was about models, methods, and artifacts. And finally, we are almost done. The last part is the appendices here, and the first one is a list of contributors, which is not super important. Then we have the sponsors, the sponsor, an appendix about the sponsor, the concept of a sponsorship, which is important for us because typically, normally project managers do not have organizational power, and in order to have resources that you need in your project, you need someone really powerful to help you with that. And on the other hand, it's not practical to expect a single person, such as a project manager, to spend a lot of time with the concrete aspects of the project, with the day-to-day aspects, with the details, and also pay attention to the high-level aspects. And therefore, it's a good idea to separate those two and have two different roles. Now, this concept is called executive in Prince2. Let me write it like this. Or, for example, in DSDM, they call it business sponsor. The concept is more or less the same. Not exactly the same. They are never exactly the same because the complete accurate meaning depends on the whole system, and the whole system is different in these cases. But anyway, that's this one. And then we have one about PMOs that I think I mentioned before. Project Management Office, or some people call it Program Management Office. Some people call it Portfolio Management Office. And some people call it Project or Program or Portfolio Management Office. Anyway, it's a centralized place for helping multiple projects. I remember a few years ago, it was really common for everyone to be talking about PMOs, and they were using it for really strange concepts. For example, I remember that some people used to call the project management system of a single project a PMO. The least we really expect from a PMO is to provide services to multiple projects. But anyway, it's a center of excellence somehow. It's a place where you can do a lot of knowledge management, which was mentioned in the previous version of the PMBOK guide as well. You can create partially tailored project management systems. You can make your projects more compatible with each other. You can give services to your program and portfolio management system, and so on. The next one is about products. The reason we have to pay special attention to this is that there's a difference between the product lifecycle and project lifecycle. In many cases, we need to consider this difference and also think about the product lifecycle when we want to make decisions inside the project. Sometimes we can have a project that is a little more expensive, but in return reduces the operation costs a lot. You may see that it's justifiable and then go for that. And when I say we, it doesn't mean you as a project manager inside the boundaries of the project. It has to be in a portfolio management system with different people involved in it, people from operations and projects and so on. But it has to be done. There's also these things recently I see, not in reputable resources, but there's this thing that some agile practitioners say that we shouldn't have projects, we shouldn't focus on projects, we have to focus on products. Which doesn't make any sense to me really, because we don't replace attention to products with attention to projects. Projects are our way of paying enough attention to products when we need to have major changes. But anyway, just because you may hear that. All right, we're there almost. Yeah, we're done. The last one is about the way the new version of the PMBOK guide was evolved, the research that was done, and so on. And then there's the glossary. And we're done. So here it is, our little mind map. Let me make it bigger a little. We talked about the fact that we have two different sections in the PMBOK guide, the standard and the guide. And for the standard, we have a chapter about value delivery where we define what value is, talk a little bit about the concept of value. And then we have this main section, which is principles. We have a list of principles. These are the things that it doesn't matter how you're running your project, which methodology you're using, you should consider all of them. It helps you prevent a lot of problems, and especially the cargo call effect. Take a look at that. And then for the guide, the second section in the book, we have the domains, the performance domains, which we talked about. These are areas that need attention, different types of things that we do. This is our focus on the outcomes. Then we have the concept of tailoring that has a chapter of its own where we go through a lot of detail about the way you can tailor your project. Then we have this set of teasers, in my opinion, for different models, methods, and artifacts in case you may find something that is useful to you. And then these extra concepts. So that was it. And also remember something, that the PMBOK guide is not a methodology. You also need to have a methodology in your project. All right, I hope it was helpful. It was useful to you. yeah, good luck with your projects, and I hope you can enjoy this new version of the PMBOK guide. Take care.